I was really pumped to do a breakdown on all of the remakes this year, but then fucking Capcom's like, what if we just remade the game that still holds up? Fine, I'll talk about Resident Evil 3, but I'm gonna complain about the length like you wouldn't believe, which is fair because you have every right to complain about mine. Granted, the game's like a month old now, so fuck me, I guess. Sadly for you, I felt passionate about it, and I'm not going to let something as silly as time and the indifference of my fellow man stop me. Also, I'm gonna be upfront, I have a lot of nasty things to say, so if you're a diehard Resident Evil fan, the last thing you're going to enjoy is getting pin-cushioned by a fucking MS Paint drawing. Though, I don't want to come off as some hoity-toity clout chaser brutalizing something for the sake of bathing in my own self-satisfaction, I want to make it clear I don't hate all of Resident Evil 3. In fact, a good amount of my opinion expressed through this video isn't because I don't care, but because I care a lot. I say that because I know some people are sitting in their chairs waiting to ignore my 45 minutes of reasoning to tell me that I simply didn't get it. So consider this a promise to look for the good as well as the bad. The most common criticism I've heard is that the game is essentially just DLC for Resident Evil 2 Remake, and it's really not hard to see why. Size aside, the game reuses the heads-up display, mechanics, and fucking animations from its predecessor, and while I'm not going to say this isn't a valid way to look at Resident Evil 3, it's worth recognizing that the game only had 1 year of development, and it really wouldn't take much to see the writing on the wall here. If I was to break my issue with the game down into one beat, it would be that it's using mechanics and theming for a genre that it isn't. Though I need to express a few facts. One, this is my opinion, and most of this video is me trying to objectively understand why I felt the way I did. 2, if you truly like this game, good for you. Liking Resident Evil 3 doesn't make you a bad person. Telling me to go fuck myself does. I've done 3 playthroughs at the time of writing, once on hardcore difficulty, the second on nightmare, and one final time trying to play as fast as possible as God intended. Though I feel that my best place to start with the actual review part is in the story. You know, the thing you do before 500 words of the video I've passed you by. But before I do, I want to put out a light spoiler warning. I don't talk too much about the story, but I do talk about mechanics, weapons, and enemies in the later half, and I don't want to ruin that for people who genuinely give a shit. The game opens with a live fast forwards video that's just a little bit too current to be comfortable before we are dropped into a first person segment. Now, Resident Evil 7 was my favorite game, so this is basically just bait for people like me, but I'm the type of guy that can really sink himself into something. I like all of the little details on hand here. There are little touches all over Jill's apartment that really make it worth crawling through. I especially like that the degree of messiness changes once Jill wakes up from her nightmare. No, I don't really have an issue with the classic build-up of tension and then release they have going on, but the release is a linear scripted chase scene. While I get that it represents the rest of the gameplay, I don't really see why this cutscene had to be here in the first place, since Jill really never opens up about these fears. This opening scene literally just details Jill sitting and watching herself turn into a zombie before shooting herself. While it's not the only nightmare she has in the game, it's never a part of the main story, but to get anywhere with this, I have to get somewhat abstract.
Persona.
Jill has PTSD from her time at Resident Evil 1. Fair enough, but this doesn't really affect her in any way. She never shows a speck of fear or general unease with the situation, despite the fact that she's literally reliving her nightmare.
Bitch can't even swim.
It's my turn, bitch! Stop it!
I'm gonna find you and put a bullet in that inflated fucking head of yours.
That'd be like dropping Grandpa back off on the beaches of Normandy, but he starts watching German Popeye cartoons. You could maybe convince me that Nemesis is a metaphor for outrunning your miserable past, but my miserable past would never sit behind a door and wait because the scripted cutscene told him that it was too early. Your only options here are to run forwards, but the game is so strict in its linearity that Nemesis will sit in place like an obedient little doggy until you pass enough distance for another cutscene to trigger. Or you can just sit next to the door and listen to his rhythmic breathing. It speaks to a very strong disconnect in the game narrative and its mechanics. Jill never shows any signs of terror, which is something she apparently very deeply feels underneath it all, so why even bother if these things don't match up? Despite it being a small touch, Leon and Claire letting out a sigh every time they spotted a zombie made them feel like they were just as invested in the situation as you are. It's like they were in the writing room and they were like, oh, what kind of personality should she have? She's gotta have an arc. And then some guy was like, duh, she's afraid of dying. Granted, I'm not going to expect high-caliber writing from the guys who named the only 2 black characters, Tyrone and Tyrell. I'll get more in-depth on Nemesis later, but I'll tell you that this scripted set piece did not fucking impress me one bit. While the writing of individual scenes is unremarkable at best, plot points are basically just Jill goes here, Nemesis follows her, so she goes somewhere else. so it's pretty hard for me to make it funny, but if I can extract humor from something as cold and unfeeling as Dead by Daylight, I'm gonna hedge my bets and say I could do it here. My first impressions of Raccoon City were pretty good. I'm a native New Yorker, so seeing all this garbage and disease strewn about made me feel right at home. Nemesis stops chasing you when you reach the city, and this is where things start to get weird on your first playthrough. If you were accustomed to the long, winding, and interconnecting streets of Resident Evil 2, then you're going to find things really toned down. First of all, the way you deal with zombies feels the same, but isn't. In Resident Evil 2, it becomes quickly apparent that killing zombies isn't a good idea. They tend to eat up too much ammo to be worth it, and you can still stun them with a shot to the head. This time, though, enemies are way less reactive. The zombies in this part of the city must have all gotten recently divorced because they take shots like you wouldn't believe. Though this isn't really an issue because ammo is more than plentiful. Oh, don't worry, you don't need to finish writing that intelligent comment, I'm already ahead of you. Yes, I'm aware this is an action game, or survival action if you're pretentious. I'm not going to harp on this too long because I really don't think there's anyone out there that believes this to be a horror game, but just in case there's any doubt, I played this for the first time with the lights off, middle of the night, headphones on, and hoping that I'd be a little afraid. I wasn't. Every enemy was presented to me in very clear terms, nor were any of my expectations on the game ever subverted. I'd love to break into horror game design and explain why something isn't scary, but I feel that would be missing the point, especially when this clearly, to me, wasn't made to scare. Except with one exception I'll get to later. So from here on, I'm just gonna call it what I see it to be. I can enjoy stupid zombie killing, but if you're going to take this down the action route, you can't craft the entire experience from horror game tools. Take aiming, for example, another thing that is almost exactly like its predecessor. To center your shot for perfect accuracy, you have to stand still for a moment to close the crosshair. This is awesome design for horror because it demands that each encounter paces itself slowly and requires your attention. For an action game, this is awful because I'm surrounded and don't have the liberty of patience on my side after being bitten, and I think the game agrees with me. Your starting handgun is the only gun that generally requires you to stand still. Both the shotgun and grenade launcher already have the crosshair centered when you ready the weapon, and the Magnum is normally an instant kill, so specific limb accuracy isn't as valuable as simply hitting the shot. I bring this up because one of the very first upgrades you can get is a laser sight for the handgun, provided it is optional, but it fundamentally erases this mechanic entirely, and I have to ask why they even bothered leaving it this way. Why make the centerpiece of your combat something you will spend the rest of the game apologizing for when you can just redesign how the aiming works? If you do want to kill a zombie, it's best to just fire several shots like you don't care, but you won't be doing that either for another reason I'll bring up shortly. No, the reason you'll be firing like you don't care is because the dismemberment system has been drastically reduced. For those who don't remember, in the RE2 make, you could shoot off particular limbs. While this mechanic is still present here, enemies are way less reactive. Occasionally you can turn one into a crawler, but if the height of your zombie AI can be outdone by a fucking Treyarch game, I'm gonna have to ask you to step outside. Action game aside, this just makes things boring. The enemies don't feel like a threat anymore, they feel like something in the way. This fundamentally dumbs the enemies down into a lifeless hollow enemy I'd find in a game like Fallout 76. It's hard to explain why the shooting doesn't feel weighty. I think it's a combination of the pacing issue I mentioned earlier and the fact that enemies react to your bullets seemingly at random. Anyone who's played a Resident Evil game knows that putting a quick bullet in a zombie Redditor noggin is enough to stun them and allow you to run past. Now that delay seemingly pops up 50% of the time. This is just a theory, but I think it has to do with their specific animations. Enemies that are walking towards you but aren't fully aware of Jill can be stunned. Once they attempt to grab you by stretching out their arms, headshots no longer stop them. I don't fucking know. The more I watch this footage, the more I think this is decided by Howie Mandel and his assortment of lucky suitcases.
And let's see how you did.
Come on, bacon.
This will allow you to run past if you haven't already barrel rolled past like the lucky good boy you are. You can also no longer escape a grabbing zombie with a knife or grenade. Instead, you're just asked to mash every button on the controller to reduce the damage, which is just unexciting. I thought we went through this renaissance when it came to QuickTime events and decided that they belong in the basement next to David Cage and the Man of Medan. I can only assume this was done to benefit the new map. Raccoon City has seemingly gone through a gastric bypass because it's been reduced to almost nothing. While this opening level has a whopping 3 optional areas, they don't feel as detailed or Metroidvania-like. A lot of people say that Resident Evil 4 was also linear, and so shut up, and my response to that is, you do realize Resident Evil 4 was a fundamentally different game, right? Resident Evil 4 did not take the same crooked camera system that worked in the Stone Age. No, Resident Evil 4 was built from the ground up to function for the game and levels inside it. When Leon and Claire go down a hallway several times, killing a zombie is an investment since the tight corridors mean you can't squeeze past them. But Raccoon City has a lot of open areas. The Resident Evil 2 map was an in-depth knot that tangled into itself and grew new frays as you explored it, but these mechanics can't work in this game because because the map has the complexity of a fucking shoelace. The problem isn't how deep each room is, but more so how you move through all of them. It's fair to assume that most players will make inches toward the safest and most brain-dead form of play, which is basically the best way I have to bring up the dodge ability. While the dodge starts off as a skillful ability, it's not long until the game turns into fucking rhythm heaven. For newcomers, the ability has a tight timing to it that will probably scare most players away. But the moment you crack the code, there's no going back for you. See a zombie, dodge, keep going. The problem isn't that it's good, it's that it's boring. Action games are usually measured by how many options a player has at his disposal and the drastic outcomes of each choice they decide to carry out. If you're going to offer something that's so strong with no real resource limit, I can't see why players would ever bother doing something else. On first runs, it's nowhere near as bad, but as the zombies start to amp up their instant kill bites in higher difficulties, this one button becomes my fucking one ring. I immediately wanted to quit my nightmare mode run just because this mechanic felt like my only option in every situation. It was like playing Dragon's Lair. I come up to an obstacle, quick time event dodge, fail and I die, press at the right time and I go past it. Some of the later areas made me less reliant on this, and it was the only thing keeping me to the end. Mind you, I wasn't dodging because I wanted to save ammo, but because if I stopped moving to kill the zombie, I was liable to get bitten by the several other ones nearby or get smashed in by the scrappy do. So fuck it, dodge roll. That's what I meant by saying that the game has a different attitude. Levels tend to spam zombies at you, and it's virtually impossible to handle them by killing them all. So ironically, by adding more, you'd incentivize doing less. This isn't even including the level design. Enemy spam aside, there's just not a lot to appreciate. I mean, look at this level in Resident Evil 2. Even without the enemies, there's a palpable atmosphere here that you can appreciate because there's no noise. Now look at this street in Resident Evil 3 and tell me what the hell there is to focus on here. There's so much going on that I can only turn my attention to my immediate threats rather than any kind of environmental storytelling. You've got burning cars, explosive barrels, legions of 15 FPS zombies on the horizon, and yet they all blur into this mass of nothingness. I might as well be playing on a bland Unity level because any attention to detail is buried by all of the yapping loud bullshit that's demanding my attention. Back to the dodging mechanic though, I don't even dislike it. I think it balances itself through the light stumble Jill does after using it. You get 3 dodges which can be chained together. With each one you chain, it increases the length that you need to recover. It can lead to moments where you begin to panic dodge and throw yourself into a corner and get yourself into more trouble. I can compare it to the block from Resident Evil 7 where you can reduce damage at the cost of losing a good portion of your vision while doing so. The regular dodge isn't the problem, no, I would reserve my issues for the perfect dodge. If you slam the button right as an enemy attack would hit you, it causes Jill to dive forwards, become invincible, and also get a slow motion Metal Gear Solid alert as well as an instant target on the zombie's weak spot. This does what you think it would and curb stomps the difficulty that should look like this, but in reality it looks more like this. It means that no matter how big a group of zombies she's facing, if you manage to pull off that perfect dodge, Jill will become invincible and slide past them all. Sure, the timing is sticky, but there's never a situation in the game that can't be solved without dodging, so you'll have plenty of time to practice. There are also no recovery frames after a perfect dodge, so you can do it again and again as long as you keep up the timing. Balance is a concern in single-player games, believe it or not, and I think it's a developer's job to convince us to use all of our assets. This won't be a big deal to a first-time player who hasn't inhaled a fuckload of electrolytes, but this is an issue that will start to rear its head near the end of the game and on subsequent playthroughs. The problem comes in the fact that when it's all you're expected to do, it's not very engaging. I mean, the only new mechanic they added in the pursuit of an action-oriented game serves to make it less interesting. That's just really how I feel about the dodge. You soon meet Nikolai, or should I say the best mastermind in Resident Evil Resistance.
Are you really trying your best? Tests.
Who shoots a guy in the head before telling Jill that she'll do better in this world if she treated everyone the same way I treat people who unironically say the word num-nums. Or he just wants to make some money or something. Imagine if Ed grew up in Russia. There aren't a lot of relevant characters in this game, but I could say that you could very easily catalog them into a brand of Dorito and you'd probably be pretty on point. Eventually you reach the power station where you face the Drain Demos enemy, I don't know if I'm saying that right, which is part disturbing hentai you've probably already watched and other half-pants-shitting nightmare. I don't even say this out of obligation, but this part in of itself is probably the best designed level in the entire game. I know this is a change in tone from the whining bitch fist I just did, but I truly unironically mean that when I say this level is better than it has any right to be. The narrow walls of the station groan with these bug-like enemies that can swarm you from all angles. Normally that wouldn't be a problem, but these enemies can infect you with a lethal parasite that doesn't go away until you use a green herb. The way that they move and pounce at you demands you take your time and systematically check the hallways you're entering and watch your back. This is helped by the great sound design that floods the area with small pattering bug feet noises to basically ensure that you constantly feel like one of these things can be approaching. The goal of this area is to reactivate the power substation so that you can leave. To do this, Jill needs to manually creep up to these dead ends and leave herself vulnerable while the camera swaps to this cinematic angle so you can find out just how screwed you actually are. The bugs can be killed like anything else, but in a swarm you're going to begin pounding on the dodge button like the backspace key after realizing what kind of hentai this actually is. Granted, if you want to stop caring, the shotgun still exists, plus this part doesn't go on any longer than 10 minutes even if you don't know where you're going. I thought this was a prelude to some longer section in the later game, but then Jill just sort of does a fat man to the nest and we move on. You see, my only gripe here is that this is the only part of the game that was remotely scary, and that says it all, doesn't it? Resident Evil 7 was a scary game, Resident Evil 2 Remake had a scary building, Resident Evil 3 has a scary room. I would say I'm upset about this, but every time I do, some sweaty Resident Evil Redditor breaks through my door and tells me that the other game wasn't good, so this one can't be either. After you blow up the only beacon of good gameplay, you begin to backtrack through the city and...
Skip it up and down.
This is basically inevitable, but I get to talk about Nemesis and his AI, and then make the most of my Animal Crossing chibi. The moment you're first confronted with him, you can immediately feel that something's off. He doesn't feel scary, threatening maybe, but scary is the farthest thing I can imagine from what looks like Pizza the Hut wearing his favorite trash bag. His main mode of attacking you is by punching you and using his whip to pull you in close when you're getting too far for him to punch you. Obviously, the only thing you can do here is run. I don't know who is still shooting at stalker enemies in horror games, but my first instinct was to just make space, but by God, it can get fucking frustrating. And I know running is the right thing to do because the game has conditioned me to sprint past every enemy. Even if I didn't pick up on that hint, every cutscene has shown this guy to react to bullets the same way that Twitch streamers react to domestic disputes. Despite this, you can actually down him. It usually takes a lot of ammo, but that's not as much a concern because killing him really requires a mastery of the dodge system. And nothing else. He also creates this super zombie type that has a ranged attack. I use the word creates in quotation because he doesn't actually do it himself, it's just implied through a cutscene. These are probably one of the harder enemy types since their head is armored and their spike attack can get pretty annoying when they bring Jill to her knees and allow someone else to finish her. Back to Nemesis though, half of the time these linear chases are scripted and seemingly stopped by random moments of nothing. Like, are you really telling me that this door is enough to stop him? It's like they're at the fucking grocery store and Jill's mom who just recognized one of her friends. I like that he puts a light under your ass, but his presence de-incentivizes other mechanics. Shooting zombies is basically out of the question when he's in pursuit. Maybe one bullet in a pinch, but he normally doesn't give you enough time or space for that. You might think it's a good idea in these situations to duck into a safe room to lose his trail. But in one of the most immersion-breaking moments of my life, he just waits there for you. I have to break my train of thought here to say that this is, in my opinion, one of the cheapest solutions to anything I've ever seen. And it further reinforces my thinking that this game wasn't poorly designed as much as it was designed with a rocket attached to every coder. I disliked Mr. X in Resident Evil 2 because he was seemingly unavoidable. He just sort of showed up in the middle of whatever I was working on to tell me I was going to be spending the next 10 minutes running to a safe room and waiting till I can try again. The solution to that was to add a stealth mechanic that would let me avoid him in a pinch so I don't get sidetracked. The other problem is that this is the only real Nemesis section in the game. Sure, he's persistent throughout the rest of the campaign, but this part is the only time you could roam around to see how he interacts with individual areas. Every single encounter that follows can be put into two sections, the ones where you run away from him and the ones where you shoot at him. So I guess I can't expect them to code something as unrealistic as a searching mode and a chasing mode when the rest of the game will spend its runtime drowning in the other. Funnily enough, the moment you escape into the subways, he chases Jill into the sewers. You can take him down here for some extra upgrades or simply kick the ventilation shaft open. This section is my least favorite in the entire game because it's the most linear. It's a straight shot between two lines with some fairly simple puzzles that revolve around this battery item. Here is where you pick up the grenade launcher and get introduced to the Hunter Gamma enemy type. To poke at the grenade launcher first, this thing has several flavors of explosives. Flame rounds, acid rounds, mine rounds, and explosive rounds for those who lived in a very boring neighborhood. Fire, acid, and explosive shots all function fairly the same, the blast radius is similar, and the only reason you would swap between these is to counter very specific enemy types, like fire for the fish enemies and acid for the hunters in the hospital. I wouldn't really bring it up, but because I feel the game giving me a dirty look every time I instantly craft something instead of banking my materials, I will. The final bomb is a mine round that almost exclusively exists for late game boss fights. They do what you think they would do, stick to walls and explode after someone comes close. Unlike the other 3 kind of rounds, you also can't craft these from the environment, but they're also usually just hanging around when you need them. The only annoying thing is that they do detonate after a while, even if no one comes by. So there's no need to inventively trap a room if you know someone will be coming through there, because later those traps will have expired and you'll look like an idiot. Again, the map design really doesn't encourage these kind of encounters with its linearity, but I really don't see why they couldn't remain on the ground to allow for some emergent gameplay. Even the Evil Within allows its traps to remain active, and that game is super linear. That's all I have to say about this new weapon. Onto the Fishmen enemies. I think most people's first experience with these things will be scary, as they take a lot of the frame and can swallow you whole in one bite. Though, after you quickly realize that these are the only enemies down here and that they are instantly cooked by the new flame rounds you get, they are nowhere near as interesting. They do appear in some later sections of the game and arguably act way better, but I'm going to jump into the finer details. If you don't want to erase them with a single flame round, the other alternative is to shoot their open mouths for extra damage. This is actually a good mechanic in my opinion, because they only open their mouths when a certain distance close enough to you, meaning that you're rewarded for putting yourself in danger, and the narrow sewer system means that you can't easily squeeze past them like you're on the fucking subway. You can't do much against them if you don't have the ammo, which is a bit of a rough spot for me. On one hand, it's my fault for not properly preparing. On the other hand, I hate the feeling that the only option I have is death. I watched a few speedrunners angle these enemies around corners to avoid the insta-bite, but I like to critique games for regular humans, not Simpsons characters. Also, for what it's worth, and because someone is asking, I've never played the original Resident Evil 3. Originally, I planned to grab a copy of the original and play it, but I can't leave my house right now, and this video is a month overdue. The way I see it, a lot of the defenses for this game have been, it's not played for scares, it's only for people who enjoyed the original, and it's supposed to be for speedrunners. If the game has gone through so much of an overhaul, I don't really see it being my problem when I say that, as it stands, from a pretty fair position, these issues bother me, and being able to appreciate something else entirely wouldn't fix that. The sewer level transitions into a burning building area where Nemesis begins to wield a flamethrower. I know that this is a large change for something that happens so fast, but I can promise you it's speedier in gameplay form. The ascent up the building is a scripted little jog without any real encounters outside of QuickTime events. This leads to the first boss fight, and I don't really like it very much. Nemesis has this one ability to dodge your grenade launcher rounds, and I truly feel like there's nothing I can do about it. I haven't noticed any kind of tell that says he's going to do it and engage accordingly. Normally, I thought this was just the game de-incentivizing using the grenade launcher in this fight, but in the same breath, there are several drops of explosive ammo hidden all over the arena. The fight has 2 phases, one where Nemesis uses a flamethrower at a distance to burn you, while his second one he drops his super soaker to start rushing you down. This is what I would consider the monsoon moment of the game, the point where if you haven't mastered the dodge mechanic, he's going to smash you around and take all your bells. In my effort to have a better understanding of the game, I jotted down my thoughts after my first playthrough. In that list, I regarded that the boss fights were my favorite part, but after subsequent playthroughs, I would say I don't really agree with that. While technically a few story beats happen between this boss fight and the next, I'm skipping straight to the next one. Mostly because the bit with Kendo is stupid and useless, and the bit with Carlos in the police station is a level I want to dedicate a lot of time to. For now though, let's take a look at this. The second boss fight I would regard among my favorites in the game, excluding the final encounter. But that was also on my first playthrough, and I have just recently finished my third, and I can't help but hate my more foolish self. This is a bit of a Schrodinger's cat situation, because I can't comprehend how I felt when I first played the game since I am no longer that person, but I'm still going to try and explain the good before I go after the bad. The Clocktower boss fight was exciting on my first run because Nemesis' attacks were devastating to my health, and I had just enough expertise with the dodge to remain on my feet. This meant that I was constantly measuring my distances, checking my surroundings to predict his next attack, and I was way more engaged with the fight. Plus, some of his behaviors can cause the battle to pace itself really well. Take this moment when he starts dancing around the walls. Normally, the goal here is to lay a landmine from the grenade launcher so that he knocks himself over. But if you want to take a risk, this is also a perfect time to get the resources hidden around the arena. If you wait too long, you are punished with an extra heavy attack that will put you in the red. Not to mention that I actually thought this environment was really pretty. It was quiet and it gave me a really nice view of the city. I was even able to appreciate this in the fight because the layout of the area is simple enough to avoid overwhelming me with information. The second time I did this fight, it felt way less impactful. as I slammed the dodge button and didn't even really care about how close this beast was to me. I was just unloading shots into its head. It was like going through the motions of the boss fight instead of actually enjoying it. This ends with Jill thinking she finally killed the creature despite literally every other thing that's happened tonight to suggest the contrary, and gets poisoned as a result. Eventually, she gets rescued by Carlos, and oh boy, let's dig into the Cool Ranch Dorito. Carlos's sections play a lot like Jill's, except for two key differences. One, he takes less damage from zombie bites, and two, instead of the dodge roll, he gets to punch zombies in the face. It's a bit jarring when you first use this because it's never explained that Carlos has a different ability, so you might end up taking a few hits against Brad over here while trying to understand what the fuck Carlos is actually doing when you press R1. His cross punch is either triggered by perfectly hitting the dodge button with an enemy attack, or pressing R1 twice with a very specific timing. Carlos's section uses the same assets from the Resident Evil 2 remake, but to be fair, they also did that in the original, so I guess staying faithful is only a priority when it saves you development time. I'd actually say that the punch is a little better than the dodge ability overall because you can follow up with that weird slow motion headshot thing, and you can proactively trigger this without having to wait for an enemy attack. This means you can essentially run up to any single zombie and use this to beat someone senseless. Sadly, the police station doesn't feature a lot of single enemies. You do face a few lickers here that might catch you off guard, but if you focused your assault rifle fire, they're not that bad. This weapon probably changes more about Carlos than both his punch and his extra health pool because it comes with 150 bullets and deals a lot of damage. I'd say it's the best weapon in the game since ammo for it is plentiful and you can kill most creatures with less than a clip. It also fires really quickly and the recoil is fairly easy to control. Perplexingly, this also has the centered shot motif, but you lose it the moment the player holds down the trigger. So unless you use assault rifles at the same pace a toddler loads wet paper into a straw, your pattern is going to be wide and you'll just have to deal with it. In a way, I don't really have a lot to say about this section except fuck this hallway right here. The problem is that they took everything that made the Raccoon City Police Department cool and just kind of reduced it into this bland series of hallways with enemy spam. After you do this, you face the previously mentioned just okay boss fight before you take Jill to the hospital. This is probably my favorite level in the game for a few reasons. While technically not a very big map, it's the most complicated area I've seen. It sprawls and has a few looping shortcuts into it, plus the narrow hallways can make the fights feel pretty intense. Though it also can be completely redoubled as an optional area for Jill once Carlos is done here. Since there are a lot of chests that need to be lockpicked open, you'll probably want to come back here. Though I'll talk about that later. First we have to talk about the new enemy type present here. While originally I was kind of terrified of these hunter enemies because of the slight insinuation that they have a one-shot lunge strike that cuts your throat open, most of the time they rely on some very basic hand swipes and dodges. This turns them into a pretty basic enemy once you get past the armored shell. Eventually you find out that Nikolai killed Carlos's target for a jawbreaker or something before he stumbles onto a vaccine to end the level. Before you can do that though, Buddy Boy over here tells you that you need to face down a wave of zombies and blow something up so that you can continue. This is where the game's intentions basically become crystal clear. You need to hold out against a giant party of enemies, including the spiny head boys, and unload all of your ammo into anything and everything. Eventually Jill wakes up and you're confronted with the final area of the game or the optional goodies in the rest of the hospital. The moment you wake up, you get the burst pistol, and I point it out for two reasons. One, I fucking hate guns with 3-round bursts. They feel like the firearm equivalent of a fidget spinner. Secondly, it's the only other gun in the game that you've acquired which brings back the focused aiming system, which is fucking poetic if you think about it. Like a real fool's journey, the handgun realized that the laser sight wasn't the solution to its problem, it was in the DPS all along. Re-exploring the hospital with Jill is kind of a treat. If you didn't kill an enemy as Carlos, he'll be waiting for Jill. Plus, you get to see how different their playstyles actually are when you go through the same section. You also still need to face down a series of hunter enemies that can force you to hide into a safe room, like those scary games I love oh so much. The lab is basically like every other section in the game. There are a couple moments where they lock you in a room and try to throw a curveball, but I can only repeat myself so many times. You get the idea. You'll go through and shoot a few enemies, or dodge roll the ones you don't want to shoot, until you create your own vaccine and get it crushed by a middle-aged Christian mother that knows better than you. The only part I feel like mentioning here is the final boss fight, both of them, because I think they're high notes for the game and I just don't give a shit about explaining the rest of this. This final fight drastically changes based on the difficulty selected. It's the same as the Clocktower fight with a wide open space and a feral enemy, and now that I'm saying it out loud, I realize the only reason I like these fights is because they remind me of Bloodborne. Though, unlike Bloodborne, it seems the devs weren't entirely sure what they were testing from the player. This time around, he runs around the top level to randomly pick a tank to hide behind. Each tank has a weak spot that can be shot to knock him down, or you can lay a mine if you don't forget something within 10 minutes of hearing it. Though I actually don't mind this since the area gets flooded with new zombies, so your attention is now divided between 3 things. Now I need to focus on where Nemesis is going, grabbing items off the floor, and trying to prevent myself from getting fucking eaten. At least, that's what I thought would happen before Carlos shows up and literally just tells me which tank to shoot. I get it, every intelligent person I've ever met has called me hopeless, but you shouldn't create a challenge and then have the AI act like my mother and solve it for me. Bringing up my later point about silently giving the boss new moves, midway through the fight he'll decide that he doesn't care about hiding behind the giant explosive canisters anymore and just jump from a random spot. I don't even think this is a hard boss. On my first playthrough I was able to take him out on my first try, but when I put him on nightmare mode, he jumps off much faster and spawns regenerating zombies that frankly only seem to die when they incidentally get hit by one of his own attacks. Hell, I don't even know what on earth I'm supposed to do when he starts thrashing around and randomly attacking. Eventually, I just turned my brain off, started laying mines on the walls instead of letting him get his stick, and unloaded all of my ammo, ironically toning down all of the fight's complexity and just forcing me to keep throwing resources at it till it stopped moving. You walk literally like 5 more steps and...
It's done. Give me the vaccine, you greedy son of a bitch.
No. You choose money. I like money.
Are you fucking kidding me? How much money do you need? You look like you spend all your time squatting outside of a 7-Eleven with a $1 Arizona in your hand. Why do you need millions? I mean, I don't particularly have a gripe with characters that see tragedy in materialistic terms when I can open Facebook and find a few of them right now, but at some point this just sounds nonsensical. He has the data on the city's demise, he has Jill's combat data with Nemesis, he has a vaccine that literally sounds pretty good right now, but no, he's still fucking coming up with another scheme. This boss fight that follows is the final boss fight, and it's literally a Resident Evil final boss. You know the type. A giant unmoving creature with soft fleshy bits on his body that cause him to become vulnerable. They said they want to recreate the past, so why not follow the stones that lead to Resident Evil 6, I guess. That said, I still like this boss fight. I know this hasn't come across after the 30 minutes of swearing and Microsoft Paint violence, but I'm somewhat of a sucker for that mournful and epic boss fight music that accompanies itself. It feels like a culmination of all the trials we've been through thus far. A lot of people have ranked this boss fairly low on their list for having a boring moveset, which is a valid point, but I think out of all the encounters, this is the only one with any narrative weight to it. It actually feels like Jill and this monster have formed some bizarre, memorable, yet hate-filled relationship. Plus, Jill actually starts to show some actual speck of emotion to what's happening around her.
Just so you know, this is the last fucking time.
Nemesis' final form entails you pushing these power sockets into place before using the railgun to blow him into enough pieces that even that chapter wouldn't bother putting it back together. It's almost perfectly adequate to the point where I don't feel like I have all that much to say, but screw it, I kind of have to. If I had to complain, I would say that one of his sweeping attacks seems to go a little farther than it should, and his 3-paw slam attack looks like it chains into itself unless you spam literally every button on the controller to make Jill stand up faster. On the other hand, he takes such a large amount of the frame that you can easily see his telegraphed attacks, though they do wind up pretty fast. There's a good amount of ammo around, so you don't really need to worry about running out, but it's best to grab all of this crap during the first phase of the fight because I don't think they programmed him with the ability to hit you until Jill shoots him with the lightning cannon thing. After this, you literally stuff a fucking explosive rod into his mouth and blow a path forward through his fucking limbs. And finally, we get to the game's ending. I've been ignoring the actual story for several reasons. One, I don't think there's a hell of a lot to actually criticize because there's nothing going on in it. Like I said before, the plot simply exists to bring the characters to a new environment and almost nothing else. But I'm actually going to talk about the story for this final stretch of the video. I also think what I'm about to say is even more contrarian and obnoxious, but we've been through so much so far. And if you're listening this far into the video, I don't know what long car ride you're stuck on, but I'd like to believe we've built enough of a bond for you to trust in what I'm about to say. One of the major selling points of Resident Evil is its characters, and Resident Evil characters are generally pretty poorly written. And I don't like to throw that word around a lot, so I'll try to simplify into saying that they're static characters. Leon goes through a night of horror, but on the other end of the processing machine, it's still the same Leon. Sure, next time we see him, he's a secret agent, but this change wasn't shown to us. It's just like, pop, here's Leon again with a longer haircut. In fact, arguably the closest any character in the series has ever gotten to having a real character arc was Chris Redfield in Resident Evil 6 as he learns to overcome his alcoholism and trust his team again. There's also Moira in Resident Evil Revelations 2 if you want the same example but with a hipster. Here, let me give you an example of what I mean. Just to note, I'm about to spoil this game even more than I already have, so here's a timestamp to skip it. Just know that if you do hit that button, you'll just have to assume I'm right forever, and that's on you. Remember that part where I brought up Nikolai at the start of the video for basically no reason? Well, I have a reason now. Early on in the game, Jill runs into Nikolai like I mentioned, as he shoots one of his fellow men in the head because he believes in looking out for yourself no matter what the cost. Meanwhile, Jill says we should be as humane as possible during a crisis. Obviously, 4 hours later, and Nikolai has revealed himself to be a really big asshole. After a brief scuffle, Carlos grabs him from behind and asks you to shoot Nikolai even though the bullet will hit Carlos too. Now, I like to consider myself a perceptive person, and knowing that Resident Evil has a tendency for good and bad endings, I stop and think about what I'm doing. Thinking that Jill needs to stick to her principles, I don't shoot him, and...
Carlos! No!
And I might be the only idiot on Earth that would actually make this decision, and I'm okay with being that minority. But I also think that this is pretty awkward storytelling. Why even give me the choice to shoot him, and why make it look like a bad idea if it isn't? It shows that all of the characters don't really have anything to them. They can be anything that the writer needs them to be because they aren't going to be pushing the plot emotionally. And yes, I am advocating for talk no jutsu in a zombie game. Fucking eat me. No, I think there's a different reason that people love these characters so much. As you can see, each character in Resident Evil clearly sticks out from their surroundings and features a well-designed outfit and style. No one in their right mind would dress up like Jill does in these circumstances, but it looks badass. It's sleek and appealing. It's been said before that we identify more with characters in third person rather than ones in first person because we can see that character triumph through adversity. You watch Jill stuff that cannon into Nemesis's mouth, and as a result, it feels like her victory. This is why I think people feel such a disdain for Ethan Winters, despite him having just about as much dialogue as any other Resident Evil hero. It also explains why people have such a seething hatred for the simplified, realistic redesign of Chris Redfield. And trust me, if you disagree, that's fine. I have a fucking Night in the Woods neon sign. I'm no stranger to owning up to my own unintelligence. But you have to agree that this is a pretty worrying trend to see, especially when a salt circle is being drawn somewhere with the words Resident Evil 4 Remake scrawled out in blood. I can go back and forth on this forever, and I know that because I did and ended up backspacing 1,000 words of MS Paint mutilation so that I could get this video under the average playtime of the game it's talking about. Resident Evil 4 did really well, but I don't know if the people who are remaking it understand why. That game was the product of desperate corporate mismanagement, a total shift in priorities, and a sense of risk and adventure in its development. No one knew if this would work, and no one just assumed that making the game this way would result in a platinum seller. You can't create a diamond without pressure. Resident Evil 4 was made from a very distinct set of circumstances that you can't emulate. I can kind of empathize with that. Sure, I have 5,000 subs, but they're all from a different game, and I just served up a 45-minute fuckfest of passive aggression. What are the odds they haven't already gotten heated and walked off the stage when I started bad-mouthing the dodge roll? Because I wholeheartedly believe that it's just mediocre. A 2.5, a 5 out of 10, something just okay, and I don't know when we decided that being just okay wasn't okay anymore. If we're talking length for value, this game is about 4 hours, and the way I see it, you should judge the quality of a game versus what you take away from it. If you had a memorable experience, I don't care if you did that in 5 hours or 60. To me, that's still a good purchase. The problem with this remake is that it doesn't have anything to say. It dropped all of its horror elements for the sake of an action game, but also doesn't really have the chops to pull out any interesting mechanics. I could accept that in service of trying to tell a story, but it really doesn't want to do that either. Personally, after all the things I've read about what I hope is Resident Evil 8, I'm more than excited. If you want a game in the Resident Evil franchise that handles action well and has a lot of your favorite characters, I'd recommend Resident Evil Revelations 2. It's lacking polish and was released in an episodic format, but it's also a good blast with a friend and has a lot of cool ideas going on inside it. Though I would sooner recommend Resident Evil 7 for an outlandish horror game that will serve up something they've never seen before. They're two very different games, but I can't help but feel like history is repeating itself here, as the games slowly get more action-packed and have a higher focus on reoccurring characters over the atmospheric horror games that I'm invested in. It's also entirely possible that the remake of Resident Evil 4 kicks ass, and this video will age about as well as I think 2020 is going to. Anyway, goodbye Carlos and Jill. I'm sure we'll see one of you in a new game sometime soon. If you enjoyed this video, I'd appreciate it if you subscribed and left a like. I poured a good amount of my time and soul into this while simultaneously second-guessing it the entire time. We also have a Discord now, so feel free to harass me in person. For fuck's sake.
I'm fly, the original. I'm fly, unpredictable. I'm nearly irresistible, and I don't even try. I'm easily excitable, completely undeniable, and sometimes unreliable. Don't ask me why, don't ask me why. I'm fly.